For more than 40 years, the shadow of a man stretched across the state of California. He was a phantom who operated under many names, a geographical chameleon whose violence evolved with his location. In the mid-1970s, he was the Visalia ransacker, a burglar who terrorized the San Joaquin Valley. Shortly after, he became the East Area rapist, a sadist who bound and tormented victims in the suburbs of Sacramento. By the time he moved south to Santa Barbara and Orange County in the late 70s and 80s, he had escalated to murder, earning the moniker of the original Night Stalker. It would take decades for investigators to definitively link these crimes to a single perpetrator, a realization that solidified into a new, terrifying title bestowed by writer Michelle McNamara: the Golden State Killer. The statistical weight of his crimes is staggering. At least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, over 100 burglaries. Yet, for all the havoc he wreaked, the man himself remained a cipher. He was a ghost who slipped through window screens and vanished into creek beds, leaving behind nothing but trauma and biological evidence that, for decades, had no voice. By the year 2018, the case was as cold as a case can get. The files filled warehouses. The detectives who had originally walked the crime scenes were retired or deceased. The biological samples sat in evidence lockers, a silent code waiting for a Rosetta Stone that did not yet exist. The conventional methods of forensic science had hit a hard wall. Law enforcement possessed the killer's full genetic profile. They had his DNA from crime scenes carefully preserved. In a standard investigation, this is the Holy Grail. However, a DNA profile is useless without a reference point. For years, investigators ran the Golden State Killer's genetic code against CODIS, the combined DNA index system maintained by the FBI. This database contains the profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees. Every time they ran the search, the system returned silence. The Golden State Killer had never been arrested for a felony, or at least never had his DNA taken and entered into the system. As long as he remained a law-abiding citizen on paper, he was invisible to the forensic gaze. This stalemate persisted until Contra Costa County investigator Paul Holes, nearing his own retirement, decided to attempt a method that was virtually unheard of in criminal investigations at the time. He looked away from criminal databases and turned his eyes toward the exploding popularity of consumer genealogy. To understand the revolution that was about to occur, one must understand the difference in the data. Traditional forensic DNA profiling looks at specific markers on the genome known as short tandem repeats, or STRs. These markers are excellent for identity verification, proving that blood at a crime scene matches suspect A. But they contain very little biological information. They are essentially a barcode. They cannot tell you about a person's eyes, their hair, or their distant ancestors. Genealogical DNA testing, the kind used by companies like Ancestry or 23andMe, looks at something entirely different. It analyzes hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. This data provides a dense, information-rich map of a human being's heritage. It can identify not just a direct match, but a third cousin twice removed. It can bridge the gap between families separated by a century of time and thousands of miles of distance. Holes and his team, including genetic genealogist Barbara Ray-Venter, faced a hurdle. They could not simply upload a rapist's DNA to Ancestry or 23andMe. Those private corporations have strict privacy policies and law enforcement barriers. Instead, they turned to GEDmatch. Unlike the corporate giants, GEDmatch was an open-source database, a passion project run by two hobbyists. It was a digital public square where serious genealogists uploaded their raw data files from other testing services to compare them with a wider pool of users. It was designed to help adoptees find birth parents and historians fill out family trees. It was never built to hunt serial killers. The investigators created a fake profile using the Golden State Killer's DNA. They uploaded the file, and for the first time in 40 years, the ghost had a family. The database did not find the killer himself. Instead, it found distant relatives. These were people who had never committed a crime, people who had simply spat into a tube to learn about their heritage, unknowingly becoming genetic informants against a relative they likely did not know existed. This sparked a process of reverse genealogy. Ray-Venter began building family trees backward and forward, looking for the intersection where these distant family lines converged. It was a tedious, manual process of elimination. They looked for a male subject, one who was the right age, one who had lived in Visalia, Sacramento, and Southern California at the precise times the crimes occurred. They pruned the branches of the tree, discarding individuals who died too young or lived elsewhere, until the tangled web of third and fourth cousins pointed toward a single, glowing variability. The name at the center of the convergence was Joseph James DeAngelo. He was a 72-year-old former police officer living a quiet life in the suburbs of Sacramento. He had been hiding in plain sight, a man who once swore to uphold the law while simultaneously dismantling lives in the dark. To confirm the hypothesis, surveillance teams watched DeAngelo. They needed his DNA to compare against the crime scene evidence, but they could not simply ask for it without tipping him off. They waited for him to discard a tissue or a soda can. Eventually, they swabbed the door handle of his car and retrieved a sample from his trash. The lab ran the comparison. It was a perfect match. On April 24th, 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested. The monster had a face, while the arrest was a triumph for justice and brought immeasurable relief to the survivors and victims' families. It simultaneously opened a Pandora's box of ethical complexities that continues to resonate through the legal and privacy landscapes. The capture of the Golden State Killer was the patient zero event for investigative genetic genealogy. It proved the concept worked, but it did so by exploiting a loophole in public trust. The million people who had uploaded their data to GEDmatch prior to 2018 had consented to help others find families, not to be dragnetted by the state. The ethical dilemma lies in the nature of DNA itself. Biometric data is fundamentally different from a password or a credit card number. If a credit card is stolen, you can cancel it. You cannot cancel your DNA. Furthermore, genetic privacy is not individual, it is collective. When one person decides to make their DNA public, they are effectively making the decision for their parents, their siblings, their children, and their distant cousins. They are exposing the genetic secrets of hundreds of people who never signed a consent form. The D'Angelo case demonstrated that anonymity is largely a myth in the genomic age. Statistical models suggest that once a database covers just 2% of a population, nearly every person in that population can be identified through third cousin matches. You do not need to be in the database to be found. You only need a relative who is. This reality fundamentally alters the concept of the Fourth Amendment and the right to privacy. Does the government have the right to search the genetic houses of innocent civilians to find a criminal hiding in the spare room of their family tree? In the wake of the Golden State Killer arrest, the reaction was swift. GEDmatch changed its terms of service, requiring users to opt in specifically for law enforcement matching. While this reduced the pool of available profiles, the genie was already out of the bottle. Dozens of cold cases, previously thought unsolvable, were closed in the months following D'Angelo's arrest. Murderers who had lived free for 30 or 40 years were suddenly receiving knocks on their doors. The psychological impact of this technology on the criminal mind is also profound. In the past, a killer knew that if he left no fingerprints and no direct DNA match in CODIS, he was safe. Time was his ally. As the years passed, the likelihood of apprehension dropped to near zero. Investigative genetic genealogy inverted this dynamic. Time is no longer a shield, it is a liability. As more people test, the net tightens. A killer's freedom now depends not on his own silence, but on the curiosity of a distant niece or nephew he has never met. The context of the Golden State Killer investigation is therefore twofold. It is the story of a relentless pursuit of a sadistic predator, a victory for the dogged detectives who refused to let the files gather dust. But it is also the story of a paradigm shift in human history. We have entered an era where our biological essence is data, where the very code that makes us who we are also binds us to everyone we are related to, for better or for worse. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo solved the crimes of the past, but it wrote the rules for the future of surveillance, privacy, and the inescapable nature of our own blood. The Golden State Killer thought he was hunting in the dark, but he failed to realize that the light was coming from within his own cells, illuminated by the collective curiosity of a society obsessed with its own origins. For over 40 years, the Golden State Killer existed not as a man, but as a phantom haunting the collective memory of California. He was a composite of terror, stitched together from the details of at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries committed between 1974 and 1986. To the public, he was a shapeshifter who had operated under different monikers across the state: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. It was not until 2000, and one that DNA analysis proved these disparate sprees were the work of a single offender. Yet, knowing the crimes were connected did not identify the criminal. The genetic profile extracted from crime scene evidence sat dormant in the combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, for decades. It was a digital fingerprint with no match, a ghost in the machine waiting for a counterpart that never arrived. By 2017, the investigation had stalled. The case files filled entire rooms, a library of misery containing thousands of names, tips, and dead ends. Paul Holes, an investigator with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, was nearing retirement. He had spent 24 years chasing this shadow, obsessed with the idea that the answer lay hidden within the biology of the killer himself. Holes understood that the traditional methods of forensic science had reached their limit. The standard DNA profile used by law enforcement, known as short tandem repeats, or STR, was designed for identity verification. It compared specific markers against a database of known offenders. If the Golden State Killer had never been arrested for a felony after the advent of DNA collection, or if he was not in the military database, he simply did not exist in the eyes of the system. Holes sought a different approach, one that would bypass the limitations of government databases and leverage the burgeoning private industry of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. He turned his attention to a rape kit collected from the 1980 murder of Charlene and Lyman Smith in Ventura County. The sample was small and degraded, a fragile chemical remnant of the violence inflicted nearly 4 decades prior. If this sample was consumed or destroyed during testing, the chance to identify the killer might vanish forever. It was a gamble of the highest order. Holmes collaborated with a private laboratory to attempt a different kind of DNA sequencing. Instead of the standard law enforcement markers, they sought to generate a single nucleotide polymorphism profile, or SNP. This type of genotyping looks at hundreds of thousands of specific points on the genome, providing a density of information capable of determining not just identity, but heritage and familial relationships. The lab succeeded. They extracted a viable SNP profile from the decades-old evidence. The next step took the investigation into uncharted legal and ethical territory. Holmes, along with other investigators, created a fake profile on GEDmatch, an open-source genealogy website. Unlike commercial sites that kept their data private, GEDmatch was a public aggregator where users voluntarily uploaded their raw DNA data to find relatives. The users had consented to share their genetic information with the public, but they likely never anticipated that their biological data would be used by the state to hunt a serial killer. The investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's profile, effectively asking the database to find anyone who shared a significant amount of DNA with the unknown suspect. The algorithm did not return a direct hit. The killer himself had never uploaded his DNA. However, the system flagged a list of distant relatives. These were not siblings or parents, but third cousins, people who shared a great-great-great-grandparent with the murderer. This was the breakthrough, but it was not a solution. It was merely a starting point. Enter Barbara Raventer, a genetic genealogist who joined the team to interpret the data. What followed was a painstaking process of reverse engineering a family tree. Raventer and the investigators had to build a genealogical map extending back to the 1800s, identifying common ancestors, and then tracing their lineage forward in time to the present day. It was a process of elimination on a massive scale. They scrutinized census records, newspaper obituaries, and birth certificates. They looked for branches of the family that had settled in California. They looked for men born within a specific date range who fit the physical description and psychological profile of the offender. The work was tedious and mathematically complex. A third cousin match meant the suspect could be any one of hundreds of individuals on a sprawling family tree. The team meticulously pruned the branches. They discarded individuals who were the wrong age, the wrong sex, or who lived in the wrong part of the country during the attacks. Slowly, the hundreds of possibilities narrowed. On April 18th, 2018, the genealogy pointed toward a specific lineage. The focus tightened on a man named Joseph James D'Angelo. He was 72 years old, living in the quiet suburb of Citrus Heights, just outside Sacramento. The biographical details that emerged were chilling in their alignment with the case profile. D'Angelo was a former police officer. He had served in Exeter during the time of the Visalia ransacker crimes, and in Auburn during the height of the East Area rapist attacks. He had been fired from the force in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent items that were essentially tools of the burglar trade. The genealogical evidence was compelling, but it was not proof. To make an arrest, investigators needed to match D'Angelo's DNA directly to the crime scene evidence. They could not simply ask him for a sample without tipping him off. Surveillance teams descended on the quiet suburban street where D'Angelo lived. They watched a man who mowed his lawn and adjusted his boat, looking for the monster who had terrorized the state. They needed his discarded genetic material. On April 18th, surveillance officers watched as D'Angelo went about his daily routine. They waited for an opportunity. It came when he left his vehicle in a public parking lot. Investigators swabbed the door handle of his car. The sample was rushed to the lab. The results were a preliminary match, but the quality was not sufficient for a courtroom-grade confirmation. They needed more. Days later, they tracked D'Angelo to a darker routine. They retrieved a tissue he had discarded in a public trash can. This second sample provided the definitive link. The DNA from the tissue was a perfect match to the semen found at the murder scenes and on the rape kits preserved since the 1970s. The phantom had a name. The ghost was flesh and blood. On April 24th, 2018, authorities moved in. As D'Angelo stepped outside his home, perhaps sensing the walls closing in, the tactical teams swarmed. The man who had once leaped fences with athletic prowess to escape capture was now an elderly retiree. Upon his arrest, he appeared confused, muttering about a roast he had in the oven. The banality of the moment stood in stark contrast to the decades of horror he had inflicted. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo was a triumph for law enforcement and a moment of profound catharsis for the survivors and victims' families. However, the method of his capture detonated a quiet explosion in the world of privacy and civil liberties. The use of GED match represented a paradigm shift. For the first time, law enforcement had accessed the genetic information of citizens who were not suspected of any crime to locate a relative who was. The individuals who whose DNA bridged the gap to D'Angelo, had effectively become genetic informants without their knowledge or consent. This incident exposed the reality that genetic privacy is no longer an individual choice, but a collective one. If a distant cousin uploads their DNA to a public database, they are inadvertently exposing their entire extended family to law enforcement scrutiny. The success of the Golden State Killer investigation launched a new era of forensic science, leading to the resolution of dozens of other cold cases. Yet it also sparked a fierce ethical debate. Critics argued that this was a violation of the Fourth Amendment, a warrantless search of biological data. Proponents argued that the public safety benefit outweighed the privacy intrusion, particularly when the data had been voluntarily uploaded to a public forum. In the wake of the arrest, GE Dematch changed its terms of service, requiring users to explicitly opt in to law enforcement matching. The landscape of criminal investigation had been irrevocably altered. The capture of the Golden State Killer proved that in the age of genetic sequencing, there are no secrets that can be buried forever, and the past is never truly gone. It lives on in the double helix, waiting for the right code to unlock it. The incident was not just the closing of a case. It was the opening of a new chapter in the history of surveillance, where the very biological fabric of a human being serves as the ultimate witness. For more than 40 years, the shadow of the Golden State Killer loomed over California, a phantom presence defined not by a face or a name, but by the sheer volume of his atrocities. He was known by many monikers during his reign of terror in the 1970s and 80s. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. It was not until 2000, and one that DNA analysis conclusively linked these disparate crime sprees to a single perpetrator. Yet identifying the man behind the genetic code remained an insurmountable challenge. The standard law enforcement tool, the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, proved useless. CODIS operates on exact matches, or close familial hits within a database of convicted offenders and arrestees. Because the killer had never been arrested for a felony that required a DNA swab, he simply did not exist within the system. He was a ghost in the machine, insulated by his own clean record. By 2017, the investigation had hit an impenetrable wall. Thousands of suspects had been investigated and cleared. Tips had dried up. The statute of limitations on the sexual assaults had long expired, leaving only the homicides as actionable offenses. Paul Holes, a cold case investigator with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, was nearing his own retirement. He had spent 24 years chasing this phantom, obsessively memorizing the case files, visiting the crime scenes, and analyzing the offender's psychology. He knew the killer was likely still alive, living out his golden years, while his victims remained frozen in trauma. In a final, desperate bid to solve the case before turning in his badge, Holmes decided to bypass traditional forensic methods entirely. The breakthrough relied on a fundamental shift in how biological evidence was utilized. Traditional forensic DNA profiling looks at short tandem repeats, or STRs, which are excellent for identity matching, but carry limited information about broader ancestry. Holmes turned instead to single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. This is the same type of detailed genetic mapping used by direct-to-consumer ancestry companies. The plan was to take the killer's preserved DNA, create a digital file of his genetic markers, and upload it to a public genealogy database. The goal was not to find the killer directly, but to find his third or fourth cousins, people who had never committed a crime, but had innocently uploaded their spit to find long-lost relatives. Holmes collaborated with Barbara Ray-Venter, a retired patent attorney with a PhD in biology, who had become an expert in genetic genealogy. They chose GEDmatch, a Florida-based open-source website where users could upload raw data from companies like Ancestry or 23andMe to cross-reference their heritage. Unlike the private databases of the corporate giants, GEDmatch was a public utility for hobbyists, and at the time, its terms of service did not explicitly prohibit law enforcement use. The ethical landscape was a gray zone, an uncharted frontier where the right to privacy collided violently with the public interest of catching a serial murderer. When they uploaded the Golden State Killer's profile, the algorithm did not return a name. Instead, it returned a list of distant matches, equivalent to third cousins. This meant the killer and these individuals shared a set of great-great-grandparents. This was the start of the tedious, manual labor of reverse genealogy. Ray-Venter and the investigative team had to build family trees back to the 1800s, identifying the common ancestors, and then painstakingly work forward in time, filling in every branch of the family tree thousands of individuals to find a single living male who fit the specific demographic profile of the killer. They were looking for a man born between 1945 and 1958, who had lived in Sacramento, Visalia, and Southern California during the specific windows of the attacks. He needed to have military or police training, given his tactical proficiency. The pool of thousands was whittled down slowly. It was a process of elimination by geography, age, and circumstance. Finally, the massive tree narrowed to a single branch. The evidence pointed toward a man named Joseph James D'Angelo. D'Angelo was a former police officer. He had been a cop in Exeter during the Visalia ransacker spree, and a cop in Auburn during the East Area rapist attacks. He had been fired in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, a minor disgrace that likely triggered his escalation from rape to murder. He had lived in the exact centers of the crime clusters. The pieces of the puzzle, separated by decades and jurisdictions, suddenly snapped together with terrifying precision. However, a genealogical lead is not probable cause for arrest. It is merely a pointer. To secure a warrant, investigators needed a direct DNA match to the crime scene evidence. In April 2018, a surveillance team descended on the sleepy suburb of Citrus Heights, California. They watched an unremarkable beige single-story house where D'Angelo, now 72 years old, lived a quiet life. He was a curmudgeonly neighbor, known for outbursts over lawn care, but otherwise invisible. The methodology of the final capture was as mundane as the science was revolutionary. Investigators trailed D'Angelo as he went about his daily routine. When he parked his car in a public lot and went into a store, detectives moved in to swab the door handle of his vehicle. This surreptitious collection is a standard police tactic. Courts have generally ruled that individuals do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy regarding biological material left in public spaces. The sample was rushed to the lab. It was a partial match, strong enough to justify further surveillance, but not enough for a courtroom lock. They needed a second, cleaner sample. The team followed D'Angelo again. This time, they retrieved a tissue he had discarded in a public trash can. The lab results from the tissue were definitive. The DNA from the trash can in Citrus Heights was a perfect match to the semen found at the murder scenes in Ventura and Santa Barbara nearly 40 years prior. The ghost had a name. On April 24th, 2018, the tactical team made their move. D'Angelo was outside working on his lawn. As officers swarmed him, the man who had once vaulted fences and terrorized entire communities appeared confused and frail. He told the officers he had a roast in the oven. The banality of his concern stood in stark contrast to the monster investigators had chased for decades. In the interrogation room, D'Angelo did not act the part of a mastermind. He slumped in his chair, muttering to himself, eventually alluding to an inner personality he called Jerry that drove him to kill. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo sent shockwaves through the global law enforcement community and the public at large. It was a triumph of justice, bringing closure to victims and families who had long ago abandoned hope. However, the method of his capture immediately ignited a fierce ethical debate that continues to reshape forensic science. The use of GED match represented a paradigm shift in privacy. The people whose DNA helped convict D'Angelo had not consented to a police investigation. They were distant relatives who had engaged in a harmless hobby. The revelation that law enforcement could effectively identify nearly anyone by pivoting through their extended family members meant that genetic anonymity was essentially obsolete. If one person in a family uploads their DNA, the entire family tree becomes accessible to scrutiny. Privacy advocates argued that this practice constituted a warrantless search of a massive biological dataset. They warned of a slippery slope where genetic information could be used to prosecute minor crimes or to track political dissidents. In response to the backlash, GED Match eventually changed its terms of service, requiring users to explicitly opt in to allow law enforcement access to their data, drastically reducing the pool of available profiles for investigators. Yet the precedent had been set. The technique, now known as investigative genetic genealogy, has since been used to solve hundreds of cold cases, identifying both murderers and the nameless victims they left behind. The capture of the Golden State Killer demonstrated that the past is never truly buried. It proved that science acts as a silent witness, waiting patiently for the tools to interpret its testimony. The investigation into Joseph James D'Angelo was not solved by a smoking gun found at the scene, nor by a confession. It was solved by the sheer persistence of investigators who refused to let the case die, and by the unintended consequences of the information age. We traded a measure of our genetic privacy for safety, a transaction that occurred quietly in the servers of a genealogy website, leading to the doorstep of an old man who thought he had gotten away with it. The Golden State Killer case closed a dark chapter in California history, but it opened a new one in the history of surveillance and civil liberty, the full implications of which we are only just beginning to understand. For over 40 years, the case file of the Golden State Killer sat as a monument to the limitations of 20th century policing. The sheer volume of physical evidence was staggering, yet it remained silent. There were fingerprints, shoe prints, and crucially, biological samples carefully preserved from crime scenes spanning the 1970s and 80s. Despite having the killer's DNA profile, law enforcement found themselves staring at a ghost. The profile did not match anyone in the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, the national database of convicted offenders. The Golden State Killer had either never been arrested for a felony, or his arrest record predated the mandatory collection of genetic material. The investigation had stalled, trapped in a loop of dead ends and cold tips. until a novel, somewhat desperate idea emerged from the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office. Investigator Paul Holes, who had spent decades chasing the shadow of the East Area rapist, was nearing retirement. He possessed a single, driving obsession to put a name to the phantom before he turned in his badge. The breakthrough did not come from a witness or a confession, but from a radical shift in forensic methodology. Holes and his team decided to bypass the government databases entirely. Instead, they turned their attention to the burgeoning world of direct-to-consumer genetic genealogy. Millions of Americans, driven by curiosity about their heritage, were voluntarily uploading their genetic data to public websites. The investigators focused on GEDmatch, an open-source database where users shared their DNA profiles to find relatives. This was uncharted legal and ethical territory. The investigators were not looking for the killer directly. They knew he was unlikely to have uploaded his own DNA. They were looking for his distant relatives. They created a fake profile using the crime scene DNA and uploaded it to the system. The algorithm did not return a direct hit, but it did provide a list of people who shared a significant amount of genetic material with the unknown subject. These were not siblings or parents, but third cousins, people who shared a set of great-great-grandparents with the killer. The investigation then shifted from high-tech science to old-fashioned detective work, working with genealogist Barbara Ray Venter. Investigators began the arduous task of building family trees. They scoured census records, newspaper obituaries, and birth announcements, reconstructing the lineages of the genetic matches. They moved backward in time to the 1800s to find the common ancestors, and then painstakingly moved forward, tracing every descendant down to the present day. It was a massive, inverted pyramid of potential suspects. The pool started with thousands of individuals. Through the process of elimination, filtering for age, gender, and geographic location, the list began to shrink. They needed a man who was the right age, who lived in California during the attacks, and who had ties to Sacramento, the East Bay, and Southern California. Slowly, the branches of the family tree were pruned away, until one name remained isolated: Joseph James D'Angelo. He was 72 years old, living a quiet life in the suburb of Citrus Heights, Sacramento. He was a former police officer, a fact that chilled investigators as it explained his tactical proficiency and his ability to evade capture for so long. He had been a cop in Exeter and Auburn during the very height of the crime sprees. Surveillance teams descended on the quiet suburban street where D'Angelo lived with his daughter and granddaughter. The objective was to obtain a surreptitious DNA sample to confirm the genealogical lead. They could not simply knock on his door without risking a standoff or the destruction of evidence. On April 18th, 2018, investigators watched D'Angelo maneuver his vehicle through town. When he parked and entered a shop, they moved in on his car. They swabbed the door handle. The initial results were promising, but not definitive enough for an arrest warrant. They needed more. Days later, they retrieved a tissue from his trash can. The lab hurried the analysis. The results were absolute. The DNA from the trash can was a perfect match to the biological evidence left at the murder scenes of Lyman and Charlene Smith in 1980. The Golden State Killer had been found. On April 24th, 2018, the tactical teams made their move. D'Angelo was outside, working on his lawn, unaware that the net had closed. When officers swarmed him, his reaction was one of shock and immediate deflation. He told them he had a roast in the oven. It was a banal, domestic detail that stood in stark contrast to the monstrous acts he was accused of. In the interrogation room, the persona of the terrifying, masked predator dissolved into that of a frail, confused old man. However, cameras captured him when he was left alone in the room. He was seen pacing, moving with an agility that belied his feigned infirmity. He began to mutter to himself, whispering about a Jerry in his head. He claimed that an inner personality forced him to do the things he did. Psychologists and investigators viewed this performance with skepticism, noting that D'Angelo had a degree in criminal justice and would be well aware of how to stage a defense based on insanity or incompetence. The arrest sent shockwaves through the global law enforcement community and the public at large. For the victims and their families, it was a moment of overwhelming relief mixed with the trauma of resurfaced memories. But beyond the emotional resolution, the case ignited a fierce global debate regarding genetic privacy. The technique used to catch D'Angelo, now known as investigative genetic genealogy, changed the landscape of forensics overnight. Suddenly, the concept of anonymity was obsolete. Even if an individual had never taken a DNA test, they could be identified through the genetic footprint of a second cousin who had taken a test on a whim. Privacy advocates raised alarms. They argued that the users of GED Match had consented to finding relatives, not to becoming genetic informants for the state. The implications were vast. If law enforcement could access these databases for murder cases, could they eventually use them for nonviolent crimes? Could insurance companies or political entities access this data? The Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable search and seizure. But the legal standing of voluntarily uploaded genetic data was murky. In the wake of the D'Angelo arrest, GED Match changed its terms of service, requiring users to explicitly opt in to to allow law enforcement access to their profiles. While this satisfied some ethical concerns, it significantly reduced the pool of data available to investigators for future cold cases. Despite the ethical firestorm, the legal proceedings against D'Angelo moved forward. The sheer scope of his crimes required a massive coordination effort between district attorneys from 6 different counties. To avoid a costly, years-long trial that would force elderly survivors to testify, the prosecution and defense reached a plea agreement. D'Angelo would plead guilty to 13 counts of murder and kidnapping to avoid the death penalty. He would also admit to dozens of rapes for which the statute of limitations had expired, acknowledging the crimes as uncharged conduct. In June 2020, a makeshift courtroom was assembled in a ballroom at Sacramento State University to accommodate the large number of victims and social distancing requirements. For 3 days, the survivors and the families of the deceased stood before Joseph James D'Angelo. They delivered victim impact statements that were raw, furious, and empowering. They spoke of the decades of fear, the ruined marriages, and the nightmares that never ceased. They stripped away the moniker of the Golden State Killer and addressed him simply as a pathetic, small man. Throughout the proceedings, D'Angelo sat in a wheelchair, staring blankly, showing no visible emotion. When asked by the judge how he pleaded, his voice was raspy and weak as he repeated the word guilty 13 times. On August 21st, 2020, Joseph James D'Angelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The judge stated that the defendant deserved no mercy. D'Angelo offered a brief, cryptic apology to the court, stating simply that he was sorry to everyone he had hurt. It was a hollow sentiment that offered no closure to those he had terrorized. The aftermath of the Golden State Killer investigation left a permanent mark on society. It solved one of the most prolific serial predator cases in American history, proving that justice has no expiration date. However, it also ushered in a new era where our biological code is no longer truly private. The capture of D'Angelo demonstrated that we are all tethered to our ancestors and our distant relatives by invisible threads of DNA. By pulling on one of those threads, law enforcement unraveled a 40-year mystery. But in doing so, they also unraveled the expectation that our genetic identity belongs solely to us. The precedent set in Sacramento solidified the reality that in the modern age, you cannot hide from your own blood.